Welcome to the Good Shepherd and the Child podcast, where we explore the spirituality of the Christian child through the method of the catechesis of the Good Shepherd. I am your host, Carrie Mecki Lozano. So today we are continuing this exploration of freedom and responsibility, freedom and discipline. We've kind of made this a continual theme throughout our season 5. And so we're bringing back Sister Maria Teresita and Claire Paglia, who are both Montessorians, to help us explore this Montessori concept of normalization and how it applies as a tool for us in regards to freedom and responsibility. Sister Maria Teresita, she's a Dominican sister, and she serves at a Catholic Montessori homeschool program in Tennessee. She is a catechist for levels 2 and 3, and she's a formation leader as well as certified Montessori guide for the elementary level. And Claire Paglia, she grew up in the atrium. She's a child of the atrium. She is also an AMI certified guide for the primary level. That's the 3 to 6-year-old level, where she served for 12 years. She is also a catechist for the level 1 in catechesis of the Good Shepherd. I hope you enjoy. Sister Maria Teresita and Claire, I am so happy to have both of you back on the podcast to continue to circle around this concept of freedom and responsibility that seems to just have infused our whole season 5, and just sit at your feet and learn so much from you. Thank you for joining us again.
Oh, thank you, Carrie.
Yeah, thank you for having us. I'm excited to be here.
I'm excited to have you both. So we're going to dive into this concept of normalization, and we have talked about it on the podcast, but it was 5 years ago. So we're going to bring it back. And this is one of those topics that it gets lifted up in formation, but just briefly. It's just one of those little nuances that we throw out that random Montessori word of normalization, and we don't isolate it to really ponder what this means. Well, I mean, it depends on who your formation leader is, of course. But what I hope to do with you guys today is to just separate this one concept of normalization and ponder what it means and how is it a tool for us in this greater concept of freedom and responsibility. So since both of you are Montessorians, I think that you are perfect people to ask, what does it even mean? What does this term normalization mean?
Yeah, well, great question. Because we do use this word, and it's one of our Montessori words. But if you've never heard it before, it might sound a little odd, to talk about normalization. And so I think to understand what normalization is, we have to first understand why we have to have it. And that goes back to our creation and then the original sin. So when we were created, God gave us, human beings, some very special gifts. Our intelligence, our will, our emotions. And when he gave them to us, he gave them to us in perfect order. It's like if you have a toolbox and you give somebody a toolbox as a gift, and it's got all these tools and they're all in perfect order. Beautiful. But then, of course, the original sin happened, and it's like somebody took the toolbox and shook it up. And so now the tools they're still there, but they're all mixed up. And the result of that is that we have a lot of disorder in our life, which Maria Montessori would call deviation. And the rest of our life really is partnering with God to kind of put that toolbox back in order. And so when the toolbox is put back in order, that's what we mean by normalization, that there is an order in the personality that is established. So also, it's important to recognize that normalization looks a little bit different in the first plane of development and the second plane and on. So before the age of reason, the normalization, it manifests itself as concentration through work. And Maria Montessori actually referred to as the crystallization of the personality. And I really love that phrase because when chemicals crystallize, they put themselves in order. Every chemical has its own particular order, which is why you can look at a rock and see what the chemicals were based on the crystallization. So it's this idea of all of those tools, those gifts that God gave us, falling into place. And Maria Montessori's great discovery was that this happens through concentration in meaningful work. After the age of reason, it still happens through meaningful work. It's just that we now have some added dimensions. With the birth of the social personality, there's another dimension there. And also with their reason beginning to develop, the ability to reason. We could say that normalization in some ways is unconscious in the first plane of development. And then in the second plane of development, it's becoming conscious. And with these new dimensions, there are also new challenges. So rather than unconsciously responding to a situation in an orderly way, we now have this reason that might present to us other possibilities, So I know that I'm supposed to wash my dishes after I eat my snack, but gosh, I really would like to do something else. And I actually don't really have to wash my dishes. I mean, what's going to happen? They'll just sit there and somebody else will wash them. So I have this temptation to behave in a way that is disorderly. This often happens also with the emotions, and we experience this ourselves as adults. When you are at the stoplight and the person in front of you is sleeping and you find yourself getting angry, it's such a small thing, really, in the vast scheme of life. But, just those few seconds of being late, we might be tempted to blow our horn really loud, when maybe the more normalized thing to do would be just to gently tap it to let the person know, oh, you can go now. It's a good time to go. We have sometimes irrational responses to situations, the emotions driving the intellect rather than the intellect responding to and directing the actions based on the information given from the emotions. So normalization in some is being able to have that order restored in our person. This becomes much more difficult after the age of reason because we begin to experience temptations that are conscious and that we have an actual opportunity to exercise our will in choosing. And because the will has to be exercised in choosing, we have the beginning of the development of virtue, where we have to repeatedly know what's the right thing to do and then choose to do it. Know what the right thing is to do and choose to do it. Know what the right thing to do is and choose to do it. And then a habit is formed. And that habit of good behavior, of ordered behavior, is what we call virtue. So that is a little summary of what normalization is. And one more thing that's really important, I think, is that we always keep in mind as adults that we also are in need of normalization. Sometimes it's easy to focus on the children. Oh, these children are not normalized. But actually, a lot of times, it could be ourselves that are not very normalized. To keep that in mind as well is a little help to humility.
You said that normalization is found in work. Is that the case across all ages, or is that unique to the first plane child?
No, and Claire, feel free to jump in and correct me, but my understanding is that normalization always occurs through work. And this is actually something we can relate to in our own lives. For example, let's say you experience disorder inside. You're sad, even though your life is relatively good, but then you are given some sort of meaningful work. And then in that work, you forget about your petty troubles because your intelligence and your will is engaged in something that is worthwhile and that actually will serve to build up the world. Even if it is a small thing, it still has an effect on the entire world. And then that brings you joy. I think it is safe to say that normalization always occurs through work, which is why it's important not to have the mindset that the children are not normalized, therefore I can't do anything with them yet. It's actually in presenting to them and giving them opportunities to work that we can assist them in the development of normalization.
I definitely agree with that. Montessori said that work is the cure. And I've seen that happen time and time again with children in both Montessori environment, at home, and in the atrium. You really want to just continue to present and present and present until something connects with the child. And once that happens, then you can slow that presenting down, and so then it's just offering things as the child needs them. But it is definitely part of the process for the child to be connected with the appropriate work that then causes that, what we call the polarization of attention, where they experience that concentration and they enjoy it and they want to seek it again. And so then that process of developing the will and normalizing and that concentration is all being cultivated at once, which is really exciting.
That's so interesting, because I've always kind of thought that if a child wants me to present, that's not necessarily a good thing. And granted, I don't think this is a black and white answer, but
No.
I'm seeing a value. Like, I have a few kids in my head right now that I could see the value of. Maybe you're presenting, not because they are asking for it, so it's like quick stimulation for them, but more because you're trying to find their niche at this moment in their life. Does that sound right at all?
Yes.
Yeah, I don't think you would, you don't want to present so much that then they're just seeking the novelty of a new presentation. The goal of the presenting is to figure out what's connecting for them, and then what's cultivating that concentration, and then you back off from there. That's really the key, because I find even in atria and also in Montessori environments, sometimes adults get caught up on rotating materials really frequently, and so then the children are seeking the novelty of the rotated material, or seeking the novelty of like, well, what's the new thing I get today? What's the new thing I'm going to see? What's it? Instead of saying, okay, what does this child need? Observing that need and then responding to that need. We're not just throwing presentations at them. We're taking that scientific approach. We don't want to,
Right. Because like Sophia said, it's less and less stimuli, to help them with their concentration. So there's a balance there that you have to be really careful with. But I can see with what you're saying, the value of trying to find that niche for a child that's really struggling with being able to find that normalization. I also found it really fascinating when you were lifting up the difference between normalization of being unconscious for the first plane and conscious for the second plane. So I would love for y'all to dive more into the difference. What does normalization actually look like for a first plane child versus a second plane child?
Sure, I'll tackle that one. So, in that first plane of development, there's a huge amount of growth that's happening, right? The child goes from a tiny infant that is completely dependent upon adults to a very capable 6-year-old by the time they're ready to start transitioning into the second plane of development. So that's 6 years of growth and a huge amount of growth and lots of things happening both physically and psychologically for the child. So when they begin in level 1, when they're 3, there is actually a shift that happens between 0 to 3, right? And then there's a shift that happens at 3 that tips them more into a more conscious awareness. They become less egocentric. They're more aware of the environment around them. And you'll see that continue as the child is in level 1. So you might see when children first begin, especially at 3 or a little bit under 3, that they're pretty scattered. They need some help. And that's where you want to present quite a bit, to give them a good bank of presentations to choose, materials to choose from. And so the ideal is as they normalize, they shift from scattered to settled. They also can shift from being unaware, they're just kind of moving about in their own world. By the end of that 3rd year of level 1, the child is way more observant. And even not even that end of that third year, you might even start seeing that the second year. All of a sudden they're aware of which children need help, where things belong, what needs to be restored. Oh, that chair's untucked. I need to tuck that back in. So that shift from unaware to observant is a really interesting thing to see. And then also what we were talking about with that subconscious movement and acting kind of being driven by the unconscious will in a way, shifting into a conscious awareness of their behavior and what's happening in the space, what's available to them. So during those first 6 years, they're really growing in independence, self-discipline, a love of learning, and a joy in receiving those new presentations they're really seeing as a gift. They also gain a respect for themselves and the space that they're in the atrium. And also their physical control and fine and gross motor really improve even in just those 3 years. It's amazing what they're capable of by the time they're done in level 1.
So through their years in level 1, the normalization should grow. Mm-hmm. So you see their ability to concentrate on a work longer. Their body slows down when they're becoming more normalized. Their body movements seem to kind of come into itself rather than these big movements seem to be kind of closer to themselves. Is that correct? Mm-hmm. These kind of interesting physical things that shows you that something deep is happening. These deep concentration that they have achieved that we call normalization is happening while they are working.
Definitely. Yeah. And it's, it grows over the time that they're in the environment, as long as the environment is responding to their needs, right? We need to have some things in place for that. Like we need order in the environment. We need a consistent routine that balances flexibility with consistency. The space needs to be organized, and it needs to be responding to the sensitive periods and human tendencies that are present for the child during that first plan development. And of course, practical life is a great way to support normalization, especially in the early years. So definitely don't skip on practical life.
Yeah.
in your space.
So by not having the space prepared, orderly, enough practical life, all of those things that you just mentioned, it can create an obstacle in the child, especially the first plane child, being able to enter into a deeper state of normalization, concentration.
Absolutely. And there are levels of concentration that the child kind of moves through as they normalize in the space. And that really begins with the polarization of attention. It's where that child has, which I mentioned a little while ago, where the child has that deeper state of concentration and they're fully engaged in what they're doing. And you really see this with some of the early practical life work, like hand washing at the stand, or table washing is another big one where you get some solid polarization of attention. But they really reach a flow state and they're very content with the work that they're doing. But those levels of concentration that begin once they have that polarization of attention, there's 4 levels. And the first is stage 1, and that's just the beginning emerging concentration. So they're still kind of flitting from work to work. You'll have bursts of concentration, and then it feels like nothing happens for a little while, and then it'll happen again. But once they hit that second stage of concentration, they're gaining momentum. They're starting to have a little bit less of it, a huge peak and then a valley of concentration. It's becoming a little bit more steady. In the third stage of concentration, work is becoming a habit. So that's where they come in, they know what's expected of them, they know how to choose a work and follow through that with that full cycle of work, of working with it, choosing a material, working with it, and then restoring it back to the shelf, ready for the next person. And that's a really big, important thing to keep in mind, especially with your newest children in the atrium, to make sure that you're following up with them on how it needs to be once it's back on the shelf so someone else can take it out. Like with polishing baskets in particular, you want to make sure, the cotton ball is replaced with a new one, that things are wiped down a little bit. But once work has really become a habit, then they approach that fourth stage of concentration where they're really mastering concentration and they enjoy having those flow states of work. And it's that time where you really feel like, you have to make an appointment with them to give them a presentation, because they really have got a pretty set idea of what they're going to be doing during the atrium time. But it's just interesting to think about that dynamic and how you kind of have this spectrum of concentration that grows as normalization grows. It's like a parallel growth that happens.
Yeah.
And you were asking earlier, what does normalization look like? And I think ultimately what it looks like is holiness. So we think about those people that we've known in our own time and place who have been saints, like Mother Teresa or Pope John Paul II, and they were normalized human beings. A lot of us, it takes a lifetime. Both of them were actually pretty elderly when they passed, which reminds us that it is the work of a lifetime. So it comes and it goes, but ultimately, I really do. And Maria Montessori, I don't think she said it that way, but that's my little supposition, is that when we think about holiness, what we're thinking about is normalization, and vice versa.
Mm-hmm. Which makes sense. Mm-hmm. Like the idea of normalization being like what you said at the very beginning, sister, of almost like our full self being in alignment.
Yeah.
Or restoring back to before the fall. So It makes sense that a truly fully normalized person is a fully holy person. And in the first episode that we did 5 years ago with Gabriela Perez on normalization, she said that a person who is normalized is infused with the Holy Spirit. So it's a beautiful spiritual thought process behind this Montessori concept that is worth pondering. Definitely worth pondering.
And I think that's why whether the child is 3 or 13 or an adult, that's why when normalization occurs, when we have those moments of normalization, what we experience is joy. So the small child will do a little jig, because they're so excited. The elementary child will just want to go throughout the entire building and show their work to everybody, because that's the joy that comes from their work and how they manifest it. And I think that's why, because that's what God made us for, is for joy. And a lot of times our lack of joy comes from this toolbox being all mixed up and trying to get it. And of course, that only happens with God's help. We always have to make sure we say that too. We need the grace.
That's so beautiful. It makes me think of the true vine parable and how it says, remain in me and then you will have complete joy.
Right.
That's beautiful. I love that. Okay. So what are some other, you listed a few, Claire, of like order, practical life, those kind of things. Make sure we have those in order to encourage practical life in our atria, in our lives, etc. What are some other suggestions, some practical suggestions that you two would give to encourage normalization?
Well, if I might just say one thing for the elementary child, and I think it's true of the level 1 child too, but perhaps even more so for the elementary child, they need time. We need time. This is often a struggle for us when we're trying to work with schedules, but these children, they really crave time to do their work, their big work. And they need the supplies too. So they need the glue and they need the big pieces of paper. Even if you just get a roll of butcher paper, that's great, because they can make it as big as they want it to be. And I've had children put pieces of paper together because it just wasn't right. And but they need the time and they need that space. So as Claire said, not bombarding them with presentations when they're really in the groove with the work. I have a group right now in my level 3. They have decided to copy one of the charts, and they got their butcher paper out, and it's huge, and they've been working on it. And I asked them at one point, I said, well, would you like to keep learning more about this, or do you want to just work on this? Oh, we need time just to work on this. I was like, okay. That's the nice thing about the elementary child, is you can kind of ask them, do you need something more right now, or are you are you good for a while? But yeah, they need time and they need space and they need materials that they can create with. So.
And I would say for level 1, especially, you really want, in addition to offering time, to really be aware of those clues of concentration, whether it's that their tongue is sticking out, or their furrowed brow, or they're sitting more still as they're working, they're calmer, more peaceful. But noticing those cues and pausing before you interrupt, right? We don't want to interrupt their concentration because they need to be able to cultivate it and develop it. And if it's consistently interrupted, they can't develop concentration. It can't be fostered. So I feel like there's a couple of things that both in Montessori training we talked about, and then just in my mind, I keep thinking, okay, pause and let it be, especially when you observe concentration. And the other things I keep in mind, which my Montessori trainer said, and I know I've said before, probably on a previous podcast, but is the not yet, stand back, wait and see. So we tend as adults to jump in too quickly to help children when they don't actually need our help. And so thinking about how do we offer just enough help, and also how do we allow for the best conditions for concentration, which means that the first thing we need to do is not interrupt it when it's happening, is a really big one. And I think that the second thing is to really have faith in the child, that the child will reveal themselves in time. And what I mean by that is that when we think about that shaken toolbox analogy, if we are doing our best to prepare ourselves and prepare the space for the child, then we're helping those tools realign, right? We're removing obstacles. And so we're having faith that the child in time will be able to pull these things together and, normalize and cultivate into the best version of themselves. Instead of just having this constant it's, this is never going to work, or, these kids, this day of the atrium was really challenging. I guess this is not working. It's going to ebb and flow, but,
right.
But just to have faith in the bigger picture, and also in the work that the child is doing internally. We're not privy to that, right? We're helping to plant the seeds, but we can't dig them up to see if they're growing. So we just have to have faith that it is the soil is rich, the child is growing, it's, things are happening, and eventually we'll see, but we can't see it in that moment.
And with the level 2 and level 3, sometimes when I feel like it's not a good day, I've discovered that when the children leave, if I go around and look at their work, I'm really, really surprised by what was happening. Like, sometimes we don't actually, and maybe it is because of not having confidence in the child, but we don't realize the work that they are doing. And it can be really encouraging just to look at their work, to go through some of their folders and see what they've been producing, or, it shows their thought and their prayer and their engagement with the work. And then, I loved, Claire, how you talked about the importance of watching, because I think that observation is really key. Perhaps the key answer to your question, Carrie, earlier about which child is perhaps taking the easy way out in wanting another presentation versus one that hasn't quite found what we call the key presentation yet, that presentation that kind of unlocks the work for them. And I think that that's really the important piece there, is the ability to observe, because there are different situations and different children will do different things for different reasons. So it's always important to observe, discern, ask the Holy Spirit, what's happening here? What does this child need?
Yeah.
And to your point, sister, I also love to discreetly take pictures when I can of the children working, because that's another way just to have a reminder of sure, there might be some things happening that feel chaotic at the moment, but to have that snapshot of look, it's happening, right? This work is happening, the concentration is happening. Or if you're in, I think most of us are in spaces where there's either two catechists or a catechist and an assistant, to really encourage your assistant to help you look for those things and to write them down, and to write down those good things that are happening. Be like, just help me find, three good things that happened today. And to focus on those things, because it's very easy to fall into the pattern of, this child was bouncing off the walls, this work didn't get put away quite right, this, in this negative pattern. But we really need to consciously shift our mindset to be looking for the good, because it's there. We have to be able to see it.
I love that. And I think that this is all just so important for our work, specifically with the religious potential of children, but also just in the greater spiritual realm of children, even outside the atrium, because we talk so much in our work about how concentration leads to contemplation, which is prayer. Yeah. Therefore, the more that we can foster this idea of normalization, the more that we can create an environment that allows more normalization, we're increasing concentration, which leads to more contemplation, which is more prayer. So even in the very young children, like when I'm in my toddler atrium, with all the love in our hearts, we have this instinct to overhelp, to get involved, rather than let them just be and struggle and figure it out. And I always say, like, they get in a zone. And that's the way I describe it to my older kids. Like I've got a few kids that are 5 and under, and then I've got big kids. And I'll have to tell my big kids all the time, nope, they're in the zone. Leave them alone. They're in the zone. Because they're like, oh, they're so cute. They're like so invested in their toys or whatever, their dirt that they're playing with or whatever it is. And they just, oh, I want to go get involved in that. And you're like, no, they're in the zone. And to protect that zone that they are in, that normalization that they are in, to help them have that muscle to be able to grow in, even when it's dirt or it's the Last Supper material in the atrium, it's an aid to prayer. It is an aid to prayer for life to be able to grow in that concentration. And Montessori talks about how the very young baby, the newborn baby, has the capability of concentrating on their mother's face for up to 45 minutes. So concentration is not something that we have to pour into the children. They actually have it innately, but out of all the love in our hearts, we have conditioned them to not be able to do it for that long anymore. And so we have to create environments in our homes, in an atria, etc., that allows for them to build that muscle back up. And it's just neat the way that then connects to their ability to have a deeper prayer life. So you've kind of touched then on things that we can do that hinder a person's capability of reaching this state of normalization, such as the not pausing, waiting, and before we interrupt them, over helping. What are some other things that might hinder a child's capability of being normalized or growing in this muscle of normalization?
And I think part of it is, knowing what our role is. And so if we are not prepared about what's developmentally appropriate, if we're not we're not preparing the space, it really impacts the child's ability to work with the materials. Even if we like zoom out a little bit and think about, our experience, if we go to the store, for example, do you want to shop in the store where all the shelves are aligned and you can find what you need when you need it? Or do you want to shop in the store where you walk in and you're like, oh my gosh, this is mass chaos. And it's the same thing for the child, right? Like they're looking for work. And so we just need to keep that in mind, to take that few minutes before the children come in to go ahead and edge the shelves, align things to the front of the shelves, make sure that the high use items, for us, like in our art materials or practical life, are restocked and ready. Are the pencils sharpened? Just little things that can have a big impact, because if they go to do that work and the material is not prepared, then it's that opportunity is lost, right? Unless if the child is determined enough to say, I need this and this and this, right? Not all of them are going to do that. Some of them are going to be like, well, that's not available, so I'm going to go and run circles around,
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I've seen it.
Yes.
The other part of that order is internally, like me, is not only do I need to prepare the space, but me, I need to prepare myself as the adult. So whether it's that examination of conscience that Jana talks about, or making sure that I have prepared myself for whatever presentations that I think might be happening today, or the order of, like, for instance, if we're going to do something bigger like baptism or procession, like making sure that things are ordered. And me and my assistant, like our roles between the two of us. When are we going to observe? Like, you try and observe first and I'll protect the space, like whatever. So that not just the physical environment to be in order, but also my internal preparation to be in order.
Yes. And I think also the other thing I would just add to that is, you mentioned, Carrie, about, like this child is in the zone, like we need to back off. The phrase I use over and over again is that's their work. So our work we can observe if that's okay with this child, or we need to go choose something else. But just acknowledging that even with babies, I did it more with my youngest than with my middle child, but noticing when was she concentrating? When was she, the moments when she noticed her hand for the first time, that was work, right? That observation, that moment, and not rushing through, I think she was, might have been on the changing table or something, but I saw her lift her hand up and she was turning it. And so I paused and I was like, we don't have to rush through the diaper change. We can just wait a minute and give her a second. But, those moments can start so early. You don't have to wait until level 1. And like you were saying, in the toddler atrium, you can protect concentration there. So you're removing obstacles when you are protecting concentration and giving them that chance, setting that boundary of this is their space, this is their work, and this is how we're helping them along. We're guiding them along the path.
Yeah. And I would say the adult is one of the most common obstacles. Right now I'm thinking about the toddler atrium, but it probably in general.
Yeah, which just leads back to the fact that it's not just the children who need normalization, it's us as well. And I think that's why Maria Montessori focused so much on the preparation of the adult, because she knew that we would very often be the obstacle, even when we're trying so hard to be of service to the child. We impose ourselves when we don't belong, or so word normalize us.
Which, when you connect normalization to being filled with the Holy Spirit, I mean, that's a beautiful prayer.
Yeah.
So I feel like a lot of people, and we've probably all heard people say that the children of today are having a harder time getting to normalization, getting to a deeper concentration. What would you say to that?
Well, you talked about the obstacles. It could be that there are some obstacles that we need to look at removing, so that they are not distracted from being able to concentrate. I suppose, I don't want to get on a soapbox here, but I do suppose that one of those might be looking at the exposure that we give children to screens. And are there some ways that we need to curb that, or bring that back into a virtuous mean? Or maybe even just not provide screens until a certain age, just to help them. But that's probably just one of many examples. I don't know, Claire, what do you think?
I think it's a really interesting question, especially if you go back and read some of Montessori's work, especially I think it was a journal of hers. And there's another one where it's someone observing in her environment. And it's fascinating to read it because there are some dynamics and situations that I'm like, I still see that now. So despite it being over 100 years ago, there are some similarities. But I do think that there are additional challenges now that, of course, were not an issue at at that time.
Right.
And I think it's helping children know how to express what they need. What do their bodies need? What kind of movement do they need? is it possible to have time outside before coming into the atrium? Or have a conversation with parents, if a child has a long drive to get to the atrium, requesting that maybe they listen to a podcast or music instead of watching something, if that's, if that child is really struggling to transition into the space.
Yeah.
And sometimes I think it's how we are inviting them into this space. Are they just coming in, walking into the room, and that's it? Or are we sitting by the door? I try to hang out by the door and greet each child and speak with them for a little bit before they come into the space. And especially for a group that is early on in the normalization process, really talking with them about, let's talk together. What are you going to start with today? So how can you really help these children figure out what they're going to be doing during that time, instead of just opening the door and being like, come on, like, go for it, but also not flipping to the opposite side of that, where there's so much control and so many large group periods that then they're not able to have that time. So you really want to thread the middle of balancing,
Right.
Setting clear expectations and helping them reach those expectations, and then, giving them space to navigate the room as well.
Right.
Which then goes back to observation.
Yes.
To be able to identify what is challenging this particular child.
Mm-hmm.
If they're in the second or third plane, you can begin. One thing that's really helpful for this are those student meetings, because they begin to think about and analyze their own ability to concentrate, and they identify, well, I've taken on too many projects, or I have not been really focused lately, or and what's really amazing about that is that's what's going to carry them through life, to moderate their own normalization throughout life, is to be able to identify what's holding me up here, what's keeping me from being able to concentrate and experience the joy of work.
Yeah, and you really see that conscious normalization versus the first plane's unconscious normalization with what you're talking about. They're able to look at themselves and say, yeah, I was able to concentrate. No, I wasn't. Here's why, etc. That's that consciousness that you were talking about earlier. Yeah.
Yes, they are amazing. They surprise me all the time.
They are so amazing. And in the book, Positive Discipline for the Montessori Classroom, they talk about this question of the children today versus children of the past. And I really appreciate that they lifted up that it's just different difficulties. It's just, there were difficulties then and there are difficulties now. They are just different. And so instead of letting that be a stop sign for us, we kind of need to see through it and how to work through those things, rather than it just be a, I don't want to say excuse, but I can't think of another word at the moment, for us to just excuse what's happening. So rather than, let's put on our detective hats and really observe the child, that scientist and saint that Montessori talked about, to really see what is going on, the full picture, and what we can adjust, like all the things that you've been lifting up throughout this conversation, to help create a space that's more conducive for normalization, which means more prayer.
Yes.
Well, I really appreciate the abundant wisdom that both of you have shared today. Like, this has been a really beautiful conversation that I hope helps everyone. I really appreciate you both.
Oh, thank you, Carrie. We appreciate you.
Yes, thank you for having us both.
Thank you all for listening to this week's episode of the Good Shepherd and the Child podcast. I hope you are enjoying learning more about freedom and responsibility. I have episode links for you in our show notes if you would like to go back and listen to the many episodes that we have done regarding this topic, including with Claire back in season 1. We had her on in episode 30 talking about freedom and discipline. I'm also putting a link to episode 4 where Gabriela Perez talks about normalization as well. Both wonderful conversations. Also in our show notes, you will find about how to become an organizational member. So these are memberships with CGS USA for a church, a parish, a school, a regional group, a diocese. You can be an organizational member and have very unique content that you have access to. Also, we have the audiobook of The Religious Potential of the Child available on Audible. This podcast is sponsored by the United States Association of the Catechesis of the Good Shepherd. If you would like to know more about the Catechesis of the Good Shepherd, or if you would like to become a member, please go to cgsusa.org. Thank you all for listening. We will see you in 2 weeks. Go and fall more deeply in love with God.